John's cell phone was found underneath his body. If he was holding it, he wouldn't have landed on it. If it fell out of his pocket, he wouldn't have landed on it. Like, it's just...
But in car accidents, items do go flying.
Yeah, but
so,
isn't it more likely that it would have been, away from him?
Hi, I'm Rachel Sharp, and I am the crime correspondent here at Daily Mail.
Hi, I'm Karen Ruiz. I am the assistant exclusives editor at Daily Mail. This is a theory about the Karen Read case. Today we're going to be looking at the prosecution and the defense in this case. And we'll look a little more closely at some of the theories circulating online.
But it's important to remember that Karen Read was actually acquitted.
Karen Read was found not guilty of second-degree murder and manslaughter in June 2025.
So today I'll be presenting the prosecution's theory.
I'm going to be presenting the defense's case.
So the prosecution's argument is that Karen Read killed Boston police officer John O'Keefe by reversing her SUV into him outside of the home of a fellow police officer, Brian Albert.
The theory is, to quote Alan Jackson, "There was no collision, there was no collision, there was no collision. John O'Keefe did not get hit by a car the morning of January 29th, 2022.
There was no collision, there was no collision, there was no collision."
Prosecutors allege that Karen backed her SUV into him and then left him for dead in the snow.
The defense argues Karen Read is being framed for John O'Keefe's murder in order to protect powerful individuals within the local law enforcement.
Karen Read's SUV had a broken taillight. That was discovered the next morning. That was something that she noticed, and also other people at the scene noticed as well. Fragments of broken taillight were then found where John's body was found. Those pieces of evidence weren't found immediately because of the extreme weather. There was very deep snow, as well as the broken taillight. Also at the scene was one of John's shoes. It's quite common for someone's shoes to come off and for the evidence to be spread out on the scene.
The defense had presented a lot of evidence in this case. I'm only going to be talking about a few key pieces of evidence. One of the main ones being the Bungle police investigation. The investigation into John's murder was led by Massachusetts State Trooper Michael Proctor. He was the lead investigator in the case. The defense argues that investigators deliberately did a sloppy job to cover up what actually happened to John O'Keefe. They pointed out that Trooper Proctor did not enter the home. He did not go into 34 Fairview Road and speak to any witnesses. And they suggest that the investigators might have actually even planted evidence, either to compensate for the mistakes that they made throughout the investigation, or what they believe is more likely to frame Karen Read. The defense attorneys did their best to try to convince the jury that there was a motive to protect the individuals inside the Albert house by showing that there was a relationship between the lead investigator, Michael Proctor, and the Alberts and the McCabe's. Personal text messages that they've obtained from Proctor's phone showed him speaking to friends, family, colleagues about Karen Read in a very shocking manner. He called her a whack job. He said he hoped she killed herself. He made a very disturbing joke about looking for nudes in her phone. Michael Proctor would eventually be fired for misconduct, for leaking info, making inappropriate jokes, even drinking on the job.
So investigators looked into the Apple Health data on John's cell phone, and they traced basically his movements using that Apple Health data. What they allege the data shows is that John's motions coincided with the movements of the car as he was traveling in the car to 34 Fairview. They match up with the car as well when the car is stopped outside the home for a couple of moments, and then there is movement again on John's cell phone. So for about 20 seconds, it appears John is moving away from the car, and then the phone stops. So then there is no more movement on the phone. The next movement is not until around 6 a.m. when John's body was found and his phone was picked up by the people who found his body. That to me is quite compelling. So I also want to talk about the car data as well. So as I mentioned, the prosecutors lined up John's cell phone data and the car data. The black box in Karen Reid's car shows that she had then driven forward in front of the Albert home, and then she reversed backwards at around 70% acceleration, reaching a speed of around 24 miles an hour. Prosecutors say that was when she reversed at speed, hitting John and causing him to fall into the lawn.
John's injuries were not consistent with someone who had been hit by an SUV. The medical examiner ruled that his cause of death was blunt force trauma. He had lots of swelling around his eyes. He had a huge gash behind his head. Both the defense and the Commonwealth recreated the alleged car collision. And what the defense found was that there's no scenario in which Karen would have backed up fast enough and hit John hard enough so that he can land on the lawn and just die from blunt force injuries. They also argued and brought in experts to say that scratches on his arm looked more like dog bite wounds, looked like teeth marks. And they believe that it had something to do with the Albert's dog, German Shepherd, Chloe.
So on the morning of January 29, when the three women arrived outside 34 Fairview and they found John lying in the snow, found his body in the snow, they called 911, and multiple people have said that during the chaos of that moment, Karen said the words, "I hit him. I hit him." Now that is something that two first responders and Jen McCabe all testified to in court. They heard her say the words, "I hit him." During the trial as well, the prosecutors also used some of Karen's other words against her as well. So Karen never testified at either of her trials, but she has done several media interviews where she has given her version of events, including one moment where she questioned whether she had clipped him with her car. So a lot of these clips ended up playing out at the trial.
And the final piece of evidence is the infamous "how long to die in the cold" Google search allegedly made by Jen McCabe. So the question is whether Jen Googled that after John's body was allegedly thrown out into the cold and staged in the front lawn, or when they discovered his body in the snow the following morning. So the defense argues that she made that search at 2:27 a.m. And according to their forensic records, she had Googled that around 2:27 a.m., which is when they believe John probably was put outside.
So how do you explain the broken taillight? Obviously the broken taillight on her car, but then also found at the scene where John's body was found.
So Karen herself had acknowledged that she had a cracked taillight on her Lexus SUV. We see later from the footage from the Ring camera that she likely cracked it by backing up into another car when she was pulling out of John's house. The defense believes that her taillight was at most just cracked and still intact. But after her car was taken into custody, that's when we see that it's smashed and completely shattered and there's pieces missing. And those pieces were later found at the scene 2 or 3 days later after John's body was discovered.
The prosecution has argued that the discovery days later is actually just kind of a matter of the elements, you know? Like John was killed during a record-breaking storm when his body was found. If the timeline that the prosecution has put on is right, was about 5 hours after he was killed, by which point the taillight pieces have, beneath lots and lots of snow that has then fallen. So, I mean, their argument and their argument from witnesses and kind of like their expert witnesses at trial is like, that is just normal.
It seems a bit unlikely for them to not have found those pieces of taillight from when they first got to the scene. The weather conditions that night definitely made things challenging and complicated things, but we heard testimony from meteorologists who recalled that there was about 3 to 5 inches of snow on the ground by the time John's body was found. So to not find giant chunks of red glass in a blanket of white snow just seems really unlikely. It also raises questions of what happened when Karen's car was taken into custody, when Michael Proctor and the other investigators had her car stored in a Sallyport garage. And then it wasn't until after that happened that they suddenly discover these taillight pieces on the ground.
But I think that's where there's contradictions in the timeline, because the prosecution have actually said that it wasn't, that they found those pieces before Michael Proctor actually had access to the car and actually had seized the car. But pieces of the taillight, as well as one of John's shoes, were all found prior to police taking custody of Karen's car.
I think it's interesting that the actual large shards of red glass from the taillight weren't found till days later after the scene had already been combed, suggesting, according to the defense, that it could have been planted or tampered with.
One of the strong pieces of evidence from the prosecution in the trial, I think, was the data, both from Karen's car as well as John's cell phone. So his Apple Health data showing that his movement correlating with being sat in a vehicle arriving outside of 34 Fairview, and a moment which is pretty significant where he appears to be moving for 20 seconds and then suddenly stops, and there is no movement on his phone after that.
Yes, and the defense did dispute a lot of the prosecution's data that was presented in court, starting with the data recorded on John's phone, his health app that tracked his movements. It also showed that he had been going up a couple flights of stairs, which suggests that he was inside the house. And what the defense believes is that the altercation took place either inside the basement or garage of the Albert residence. Experts also testified that it was very unlikely and not possible for Karen to back up her car at such a velocity in such a short distance, because it didn't travel very far and her SUV couldn't have not gained that much speed in such a short distance, enough to send John's body flying across the lawn. Also, John's cell phone was found underneath his body. If he was holding it, he wouldn't have landed on it. If it fell out of his pocket, he wouldn't have landed on it. Like, it's just...
But in car accidents, items do go flying. And the expert also did explain their interpretation of the flights of stairs as being actually when he was still in the car and the car was going up elevation.
Well, the defense made another good point. They suggested that his phone and other items of John's could have been tampered with. There was Ring camera footage at John's house that went missing. One of the theories or questions that were brought up by social media sleuths and even defense attorneys is that they could have taken John's phone and deleted this footage. Because the investigation was so sloppy, it raised so many questions about what else could they have done to mess with the timeline and what actually happened.
Okay, but there's also her comments at the scene when John's body is discovered on the morning of January 29th, and she is heard by at least 3 witnesses saying, "I hit him, I hit him."
What I think is really interesting, and what the defense pointed out, is over the course of the investigation, it seems like Karen's comments sort of became misconstrued or just evolved into something totally different. At first, she was quoted as saying, "Could I have hit him? Did I hit him?" She claims herself that she was just asking a question, out of shock and fear, like, could I have been responsible for this? It wasn't until the charges and all these allegations came out that suddenly the narrative and the quote changed to, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." And I think that raised a lot of questions because it just seemed like the prosecution was just misquoting her to make it seem like she was admitting guilt, when in reality, she was hysterical. She was probably still drunk at the time, or, it's 6 a.m. In my opinion, and what the defense believes is just a natural reaction to what's seeing her boyfriend dead on the ground and of just shock and fear.
Or is it her realizing the gravity of what she's done? There's no escaping the fact that things were clearly quite rocky that day, that she left the scene furious with him. Those voicemails, they could be seen to be quite incriminating. She is saying, "I hate you," calling him various names. She's furious with him, and she's left the scene. She's gone home. She's possibly sobered up a little bit. She's calling him. She is realizing he's not coming home, and the realization of what she has actually done is actually dawning on her. She returns to the scene and she realizes, have I just killed my boyfriend?
A lot of people brought up that in other murder cases or, in situations where a woman is accused of killing or harming her partner, you sort of distance yourself from the scene and you try to cover it up, where Karen didn't seem to do that at all. She went home and, she leaves all these voicemails where she's blowing up at him, like you said, and she's angry and she's saying she hates him and she's calling him a pervert. But she's also asking, where are you? Where are you? And to me, it seems like if she had actually hit him with her car, she wouldn't have been doing all of that, because she would know exactly where his body is. And at the time, and according to the voicemails, she just seems like she's very drunk, very confused, very angry, very emotional.
See, I think there's a lot to be said for how much possibly, though, alcohol played a part in that, and that, how much of a kind of rational mindset someone was in that moment. And to come back to your point where on, her inserting herself into the scene, that she wouldn't have done that. Depending on how you interpret what happened before arriving at the scene, it could be seen that she did try to kind of remove herself from it.
I will admit that I think the defense, especially in the second trial, really tried to steer the conversation away from the drinking and the alcohol. They didn't want to focus on that, because I think the likelihood is they were all very, very drunk. And it wasn't just Karen, it was also Jen McCabe and the Alberts that were drinking. And when you take into account alcohol, everyone's going to have a very distorted view of how things played out that night. What do you make of how Trooper Proctor handled the investigation? After arriving at the scene and finding John's body, they never went inside the home to check out the scene inside the home. They never interviewed the witnesses inside the home, Brian, Albert, and his wife. The investigation, it seems, they focused solely on John outside and nothing else. And it raises questions as to why they wouldn't go inside and interview a Boston police officer who had been with John the night before.
I mean, the way they justified that is that, there was no evidence that he'd ever gone inside the home. There was no indication he'd gone inside the home. So the home was not the crime scene.
But don't you think, just as an investigator, someone with, years and years of experience, even if it's unlikely, or even though you have nothing to suggest in the moment that something took place inside, there's a body found on the property of a homeowner and you don't think to speak to the homeowner. It just seems like it was a very easy starting point, or something that probably wouldn't have been overlooked in another case. Even in the trial, we saw that they still stood by their decisions to not have entered the home. They don't think it would have made any difference.
Yeah, I do agree that this investigation, there's certain elements of this investigation that were not handled correctly. The fact, the lead investigator on the case has now lost his job over his handling of the case shows that there was obvious mistakes, obvious flaws, but that doesn't take away from all of the evidence that does support the prosecution's case.
It also brought up a lot of questions. I think everyone understood and was in agreement whether, it hurt the prosecution to admit that the investigation wasn't handled properly. It did raise questions whether, was this a result of just incompetence, or was it deliberate? And, when you look deeper into the relationships between these members of law enforcement, Trooper Proctor had a relationship with the Alberts and the McCabes that was beyond professional. They appeared to be family friends. The way he spoke about Karen in those text messages, he's talking to his friends and his colleagues about a police investigation into a murder. And he's making these very flippant, inappropriate remarks about her. And I think that just shows clear bias and points to that maybe there is something deeper there, that there actually was a motive to protect people inside the house and blame someone else for his murder.
I mean, I certainly think that is why this case has kind of blown up so much on social media and also within like the community, because it's fed into that distrust within Boston Police that was already there and has been there for decades. So whether that is why people have got behind the case or whether it's the evidence is, I guess, up for debate.
What do you make of the condition of John's body when he was found? Do you believe his injuries are consistent with someone that got hit by a car?
Prosecution experts would say that yes, they were. You know, that actually when someone is hit by a car, in terms of the way items were in various places, that matched how someone is hit by a car, and that often their shoes come off and things like that. But also that he was knocked by the car and then fell backwards and hit his head, and that is the blunt force trauma injury that was obviously listed on his autopsy.
Well, we heard from experts from the defense who all agreed that his injuries were not consistent with a vehicle collision. Typical cases where someone is struck by a car, you usually see broken limbs, injuries to their legs, especially their arms. But John had very few injuries to his legs. Most of his injuries were on his face. He had a lot of swelling. He had a huge gash in the back of his head. He had scratches on his right arm, which we heard the defense believes were caused by a dog. And they don't believe he was hit by a car at all. And we heard from experts who took the stand who said that there is no evidence to support that he was involved in a car collision. His cause of death was determined to be by blunt force trauma and some hypothermia. I think the hypothermia claim is also interesting because if John had died shortly after midnight, like the prosecution claims, and his body was found 6 hours later in the middle of a blizzard below freezing temperatures, his body would have shown much stronger signs of hypothermia. So the injuries don't really add up. And at the time that John would have died, let's say it was after Karen allegedly hit him, there was very little snow on the ground, and his body actually would have been visible by those people coming in and out of the Alberts house that night. Several people arrived after John and Karen did, and many of those witnesses did not report seeing a body on the lawn. And the defense pointed out how unlikely it is for someone to just miss this 6-foot-something, 200-something-pound man lying on the lawn, being left for dead. As we know, the Alberts owned a dog, a German Shepherd named Chloe, that had a history of being aggressive. So it seemed very likely that those injuries on his right arm were caused by a dog during some sort of altercation that took place inside the house. And I think it doesn't help their case that Chloe was eventually rehomed.
So the expert that supported the theory of the dog bite actually was undermined quite a bit by the prosecution, that actually wasn't really a field of their expertise.
I also think it's worth noting that the defense hired their own experts to recreate the car collision, and they used the same experts that the FBI used in the federal investigation, which also concluded that there was no evidence that John O'Keefe had been hit by a car. And that brings me to our final point, which I believe is perhaps one of the most damning pieces of evidence, the infamous House Long to Die in Cold Google search by Jen McCabe. As we know, this is highly controversial, and the defense believes that Jen would have made this Google search at 2:27 a.m. after John's body was dumped outside of the home. And if that search was made at 2:27 a.m., it suggests that Jen and the other people in the Albert house knew John's body was outside in the cold at that time, hours before Karen discovered him outside the lawn the following morning.
But if it was made at 6:24, then that obviously changes the situation massively. So Jen McCabe says that she actually made that search at 6:24 after they had found John's body in the snow outside the Albert home. And she actually said that it was Karen who told her to do the search because they were panicking about John. And so Karen asked her to search hypothermia, look up how long someone would survive in the cold. So that is Jen McCabe's version of events, and that was backed up by the prosecution experts who actually said that 2:27 is the time that the Google tab was first created or first opened, not the time that a specific search on that tab was created.
You have two experts saying two different things, but I think it's hard to ignore that there is a record of a 2:27 a.m. search, while the prosecution's experts argue that that was just the time the tab was created. The defense says, no, that was the time the search was made. What some people on social media also pointed out is how bizarre it would be for, if Karen had asked Jen, hey, Google hypothermia, why she didn't just Google hypothermia, but instead of Googling how long does it take to die in the cold, which I think is very telling and pretty significant wording there that works against the prosecution.
I mean, there's obviously very strong views on both sides. There's obviously conflicting opinions and conflicting evidence. And I mean, a lot of it comes down to interpretations of evidence. So a defense expert and a prosecution expert are looking at the same pieces of evidence and they're coming to different conclusions. I think that how long to die in the cold, that solving the case could actually potentially be solved by getting to the bottom of that, but it does depend on who the expert is and which expert you believe. But at the end of the day, Karen Reid was found not guilty of murder and of manslaughter, and no one else has been charged in connection to John O'Keefe's death.
I think Karen Reid's acquittal on those charges after 2 trials is a testament to how good of a job the defense did in creating reasonable doubt. And a lot of that had to do with the Bungle investigation. It became a wider examination into law enforcement and exposed or highlighted these allegations of bias and misconduct and corruption within the Boston Police Department and the Canton Police Department and just, I think, law enforcement in general. And, after 2 trials, one ending with a hung jury and weeks of proceedings and testimony, the jury ultimately found Karen not guilty of second-degree murder and manslaughter on June 18th, 2025.